It's been a little over 10 years ago. I've been at a new church for 20 years, and someone that I really liked and really admired gave this speech. And in the speech, threw out this quote, this very simple quote, kind of you've heard it before, but unless you try to do something beyond what you have already mastered, you will never grow. And I was like, yeah, that is what I'm always preaching. That is my whole life as a new church pastor. I mean, that is what I've been trying to do this whole time. It's not just start a church in Olathe, start a church that welcomes everybody, gay and lesbian and in between in Olathe, right? It's not just build a sanctuary. It's build a sanctuary that's beautiful and sacred and eco-sensitive. It's like always trying and stretching to do something different and fresh. And I felt like I preach that all the time. I'm always saying, you know, whether you're sending your kid off to kindergarten or college, the wish isn't all the success in the world, right? It's how about a little challenge and trial? Because that's really what makes us grow and stretch. And so, in good Holly fashion, you know, I had the quote printed up and then laminated it and then gave it to my kids and everybody I knew and put it all over my house, you know, and I was like, because, you know, the reality is, for most of us, stretching and going in new ways is not really our go-to. And we talked about that last week with the call of Abraham and Sarah. We talked about how like we tend to be all about the familiar, you know, whether the familiar is really great, like things are going awesome and I'm such a success, or rather like it's a terrible relationship, but it's familiar. And now and then you meet somebody who makes their life out of going in fresh directions, like John Gardner. John Gardner was the one lone Republican in President Johnson's administration. In 1965, LBJ appointed John Gardner to be the head of HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, which ended up being a very big job because it fell to John Gardner to you know, implement the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And then there were a couple of other small things like Medicare and Medicaid. And then there was like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, right? Like public TV and public radio. I mean, this was a job, right? And he was going gangbusters. And then in 1968, in March, he resigned over protest to the Vietnam War. I think he was the only person in LBJ's cabinet who did that. And then 2 years later, he started all over. And he started an organization called Common Cause, whose initial goal was opposing the war, campaign finance reform, still going strong. If you look at it now, they're all about the Voting Rights Act and racial justice, Black Lives Matter. And then 10 years later, John Gardner started over and he started a group called Independent Sector, which if you work in nonprofits, that's an organization that's really been formidable about helping to strengthen nonprofits. You look at it up now, they're still going, they're all about Voting Rights Act, economic justice, racial justice. And then John Gardner started over and he started a group called Encore, which was all about helping seniors being engaged in volunteer work. I didn't know the guy at all. He was 90, 89 when he died 20 years ago, but Jacqueline Novogratz, who's my age, who's one of my heroes, she talks about him as a mentor she had. And Jacqueline Novogratz, when she was 25, she had this great career going about international finance. She was taken off, and then she realized, I'm making rich people richer. And she was working in Brazil, and she spent every weekend in the slums, the favelas. And so she decided, and I've talked about her before, that she would leave that and start over. And she went to Africa, and she started working in microcredit. And then she went to India, and then before you knew it, she started an organization called Acumen, and their tagline is, changing the way the world tackles poverty. And she talked about how like what we were doing wasn't working. Some people are like, it's all about the free market, just give it enough time and they're gonna start paying attention to the world's poorest poor, right? They're gonna go, we're tired of making iPhones, we're gonna make water drilling systems. But that never happens, right? Because the poor can't somehow get the attention of the markets. And then on the other end, there are people who are like, you know, the whole answer is aid, development. And she's like, no, it's both things together. So she started this organization that brings innovative social entrepreneurs together with people who are willing to invest patiently, patient capital. They want a return, but it didn't have to be enormous. So she started like 136 organizations from that, like the group I've talked about, Delight. It's a group of Peace Corps volunteers who are like, let's set a goal of eradicating kerosene because it's dangerous and damaging to the earth. Let's get 1 billion people with solar lights, and now they've gotten 100 million solar lights out. So Jacqueline Novogratz says, if you want to change the way the world tackles poverty, if you want to change that relationship in your life that's really not what it should be, leap and the net will appear, right? Or that whole idea that, and this is what I really appreciate about what she says, that the work will teach you, right? That if you just stretch and push yourself out there, that you don't have to know every single thing, and you're gonna make mistakes, but in the doing, you grow. And that's exactly what we hear today in this gospel lesson. This may be about my favorite character. I love this Bartimaeus dude. Okay, so we're at the end of chapter 10, and chapter 8, 9, and 10 kind of go together, and Jesus has been trying to tell the disciples the same thing. The disciples are over here, and they're like, who do you like better, me or Paula? And Jesus is like, okay, really? Whoever wants to be first has to be last, and whoever wants to save their life has to lose it. I know, yeah, but really, do you think I'm prettier or is Ellie prettier? No, really? No, really, I really mean it. If you want your life, you gotta lose it, right? And if you want to be the first, and then they're like, yeah, I know, but couldn't we have some Roman power? Like, couldn't we have the country with all the oil and all the vaccines and then still take a Christmas offering for the poor? And Jesus is like, no, really? If you really want to follow me, then there's going to be some suffering, and there's going to be some laying down your life, and there's going to be some willingness to accept that life is not about being the greatest, but it's about being the servant. Now, sometimes I'm there, and then sometimes I have this week talking about the loop when you're like, you're on your loop. This has been my loop. It's been like comparing myself to like other clergy, other pastors my age, and where they are and where. And it's like, really? And it's like, no. As it turns out, the way to get free of that is to remind yourself that it's really not about being the greatest or the best or the person who has the most toys. It's about serving, right? My friend Matt Meyer Bolton, I love what he says about this passage, these 3 chapters of 8 and 9 and 10. It's like in this section, we see that we live in this prison, these prison bars, and we're inside and we lock the door, right? And all we have to do is just open it and step out. And so then the crescendo is here's this Bartimaeus. The chapter 8 began with the blind guy. Chapter 10 is going to end with the blind guy. All of this is in between. The blind guy's sitting there with his cloak begging, and Jesus walks by. He calls out for Jesus. We think it's a healing service, but no, it turns out it's a call. It's a call. Jesus calls him 3 times, and Bartimaeus springs up. He leaves it there. He's the farmer's plow. It's his barber's scissors. It's his, laptop, and he follows and he goes in a new, fresh direction. That's exactly what Lama Chuck did at the Rime Buddhist Temple. I don't know how many of you remember Lama Chuck. He was the founder of the Buddhist temple, and if you ever saw him, he looked more like, a football coach at Raytown High School than like a Buddhist monk, right? He kind of had that, he didn't really kind of fit the part, and I knew Lama Chuck already before we started worshiping there. He and I were both columnists for the Kansas City Star, and Helen Gray, the religion editor, she'd often give us the exact same question. Seems like she'd pair us, it seemed like most weeks. And my fan club, which was about 5 people, they would always send me these emails. I love your answer, and I love Lama Chuck's answer, and I love how you all always say the same thing. And then my not fan club, which was significantly larger, would be like, how can you call yourself a Christian? You always say the same thing the Buddhist monk says, But anyway, so I knew Lama Chuck, and we'd been at interfaith things together. And it was in late October of 2011, and we were meeting for coffee with Bob Wechter, founding member of Peace Church, and somebody I met in 1987 when I first moved here as a young pastor, and Bob's fiancee, Cassie, who was a member of the Buddhist temple, and we were meeting to kind of plan their wedding, which was going to be on Veterans Day, since Bob was a Vietnam vet and served in the served vets, and so we were planning it, and I don't know if it was Bob or me mentioned, I started this church, we're gonna have a place to meet, and Lama Chuck was like, how about the temple? We're free Sunday afternoon and evening. And if you knew Lama Chuck at all, that was kind of a Lama Chuck move, because he was very interested in harmony and peace, and he also didn't have much interest in his board, and like checking about what they thought. And he died, you may have seen that he died in last month. So there have been several stories about him. He had retired from the Buddhist temple in 2015, and then he had moved off to Oregon with his beloved wife, who was also a Buddhist chaplain. And the articles talked about that. They talked about how he was just this kind of really free spirit. And I had forgotten that Lama Chuck had not been a Buddhist monk that long. He really kind of came to it in his mid-50s. Before that, he had been a magician and a comedian. And he had his own company, his own production company, and he would supply things like human bowling pins and bungee jumping and things like that, and he went by the name Mr. Fabulous. And then at some point, in the 90s, he decided that he felt this call to be a Buddhist monk, and he didn't go the typical route of 10 years of study and 3 months of solitude and quiet. He just decided to start, his temple, and which used to be a congregational church. And there was some question about that, but oh my gosh, how many more people in our city learned to chant and meditate because of Lama Chut, right? And I kept thinking about that when one person decides to go in a new, fresh way, what happens? Everybody goes in a new, fresh way, right? One person decides, I'm not drinking anymore, and before you know, the whole family's different, right? Our mom decides, or dad decides, I'm going to eat healthy, and I'm not going to pick up everybody's socks anymore, and then before you know it, everybody's got to do things differently, right? So there was that truth about Lama Chut, that he didn't just go in a new way, he kind of made it possible for us to go in a new way. And so before you knew it, here we were, this new church worshiping in the Buddhist temple. And while we just did it for 7 months, and while we also had a southern location that was not exactly traditional, but in a more traditional setting, the reality is that those 7 months, they really set us on our course. They really kind of charted our DNA as a congregation, because they really kind of forced us to go in really fresh, different ways. I mean, I remember before the services, it wasn't just like, who can make the coffee? It was like, who can move the Buddhas and move the Buddhist prayer cushions? And, and then the youth were having their youth meetings, surrounded by all of this. And then there was yoga before the service. And I can't begin to say how much we needed that, because while I might have spent a lot of time talking about, unless you try to do something beyond what you have already done, you'll never grow. The reality is, the few years before we started Peace Church, I wasn't doing much new. I'd kind of gotten to a place of some success and some comfort and could kind of coast and maybe breathe a little, and thank God that was all taken away, right? Because then what happens? You have to go in a totally fresh new way, and you have to break open your life, and you have to go, okay, what's next, right? What's now? What am I going to try today? What's going to be something new and different that's going to be called out of me? And not just me, but the whole church. And this whole church has become a fresh new place. I mean, I just keep thinking about these COVID days. We've done okay because you know what? Throw what else at us, right? And it's not just been the challenge, right? It's not just been that go in a different way. There's also been so much beauty and glory and delight. I think about that very first Christmas Eve. I mean, we had a service out south. I remember Oliver Manriquez was all of 3 months old, and seeing that precious holy family. But then Christmas Eve at the Buddhist temple. Really, who had ever done something like that? And I remember that cold night, and I remember the darkness of the sanctuary, kind of gold and red of the little Buddhas, and the candles flickering. And I remember singing, and then I remember the bone breaks coming in, kind of like a Mary and Joseph, Casey, the little shepherd, and then 23-day-old Cadence in this crushed red velvet. And I know when I saw her, I don't know if a pastor can be converted in a Buddhist temple, but it was like my heart that already had a pretty good crack in it. It just broke open, So I wonder about that for all of us, really. Little Peace Church. Could there have ever been a congregation designed more for a time like this, right? What's not broken right now? What institution doesn't need healing? And here we are, so fresh, so ready, so open. So may this time, this next decade, be an opportunity where we will be so open as individuals, so ready to just let it go, to open the prison bars, to step out. And may it be a time for this church to dig in, to reach out, to say yes. Amen. Amen.